Welcome, and thank you for being here. You're listening to Sleepy Historian, a quiet place where history is allowed to move slowly, where stories are told without urgency, and where it's perfectly fine if you drift in and out of sleep along the way. Before we begin, take a moment to settle. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow, just a little. There's nothing you need to remember tonight, nothing you need to hold on to. The story will continue whether you listen closely or not. Tonight, we're going to step back into a kind of Christmas that feels very distant from our own. A Christmas without electric light, without central heat, without thick glass windows, insulated walls, or endless supplies of fuel. For most of human history, Christmas arrived not wrapped in warmth and brightness, but carried quietly into the darkest, coldest days of the year. It came when daylight was weakest, when the sun rose late and disappeared early, when stone and earth had already given up the last traces of stored warmth. And long before celebration, comfort, or cheer could be considered, people first had to endure the night. This is not a story of feasts and songs. Not really. Those existed, yes, but only on the surface. Beneath them was something steadier and more serious. The understanding that winter, especially in late December, asked something from the body. From patience, from habit, from quiet endurance. In medieval villages, towns, and castles, Christmas fell at a moment when survival routines were already stretched thin. Food had been carefully measured. Firewood was counted. Animals were brought closer to living spaces. Every household knew that winter was not something to defeat, but something to move through slowly, without waste. At night, especially, the cold had a way of becoming present. Not dramatic, not sudden, just there. Stone walls, which seemed strong and protective during the day, cooled quickly after sunset. They absorbed the darkness and released cold back into the room. Wooden homes fared only slightly better. Even the largest hearth could not fully warm a space once the fire was allowed to fade. And it had to fade. Fuel was never endless. So Christmas night, like so many winter nights, was shaped by careful decisions. Fires were banked, not fed freely. Candles were used sparingly, then extinguished early. Darkness filled rooms not because people preferred it, but because light was expensive. You might imagine a medieval Christmas evening as lively and bright. But more often it was quiet, contained, measured. The day would have already been short. By late afternoon, the light outside would thin and cool, sliding low across frozen ground and bare branches. Inside, people moved deliberately, finishing tasks before darkness fully arrived. There was a shared awareness that once night settled in, movement would slow. And with night came stillness. This is where the quiet survival begins. Not with danger, but with awareness. People understood that the cold was strongest in the hours before dawn, and that sleep itself carried small risks. Fires burned lower as the night progressed. Bodies cooled without notice. The line between rest and vulnerability was thin, even if no one spoke of it openly. Not everyone who went to sleep on a winter night would wake easily. Some did not wake again. The understanding was present, but never dramatic. It was simply part of life. And yet, Christmas was still observed. Not loudly, not extravagantly. It was marked with routine, with prayer, with familiar words spoken softly in rooms where breath could still be seen in the air. Faith offered structure when warmth could not. Habit provided steadiness when comfort was absent. As you listen tonight, you don't need to imagine hardship sharply. There will be no scenes of suffering, no urgency, no raised voices. Instead, you'll notice how slowly everything moves, how people adapted rather than resisted, how survival often looked like doing less, not more. You might picture a household settling in for the night, bedding layered carefully, cloaks folded nearby, children positioned between adults for warmth, animals housed close below or beside living spaces, their presence adding just a trace of heat. The room would darken gradually. The fire would quiet. Sound would soften. Outside, the cold waited patiently. It always did. This was the environment in which Christmas existed for centuries. Not as a burst of comfort in winter, but as a pause within it. A reminder of continuity. of shared endurance, of the promise, quiet and distant, that light would eventually return. If you're listening while resting, you may already feel how this pace invites sleep. There's nothing here that needs resolution. No climax to anticipate. Just hours passing, one after another, much like those long winter nights of the past. If you find yourself drifting, that's perfectly fine. The story will continue softly. And if you're awake, simply listen without effort. Let the details come and go. Let the rhythm do the work. If this kind of slow history helps you rest, you're welcome to like the video, subscribe, or leave a quiet comment. Only if it feels natural to do so. There's no rush and no obligation. Now, as the last daylight fades and Christmas night begins to settle in, we'll move gently forward into the hours before darkness fully takes hold, and into the ways people prepared themselves for a long, cold night they already knew well. By late December, the day had already done most of its leaving. Long before Christmas night arrived, people were living inside shortened hours, adjusting themselves to a world where daylight felt borrowed rather than guaranteed. The sun rose slowly, often hidden behind low clouds or winter haze, and when it did appear, it stayed close to the horizon, offering more suggestion than warmth. Morning light arrived late enough that many tasks began in half shadow. Frost clung to door frames. Paths were stiff beneath boots. Breath showed immediately, even indoors, until bodies and movement stirred the air. The day's work was shaped not by clocks, but by light itself, and everyone knew that once the sun began to lower, there would be little time left. As afternoon crept in, twilight began early. Not a sudden dimming, but a gradual thinning of brightness. Colors softened, edges blurred. The world seemed to draw inward, as though conserving itself. Inside homes and castle chambers alike, this was a familiar signal. Movements became more deliberate. Conversations slowed. Tasks that required clear vision were finished quickly or set aside. No one wasted energy pretending the day was longer than it was. You might imagine that people hurried at this hour, rushing to prepare for the night. But most did not. Rushing cost energy, and energy was precious. Instead, they worked steadily, guided by habit built over many winters. Candles were not lit immediately. Firewood was not added without thought. Light, like warmth, was something to be released slowly. As the sun dipped lower, its light entered rooms at shallow angles, slipping across floors and walls before disappearing entirely. In stone buildings, the cold followed quickly behind. Stone absorbed warmth during the day, but once the sun was gone, it released that warmth back into the room, and then beyond it, into the night. This was especially true during Christmas week. By then, the ground had been cold for weeks. Moisture had settled deep into walls and floors. Even during daylight, the cold lingered, waiting for darkness to claim full control. Outside, the village or castle grounds grew quiet. Animals were brought in closer. Chickens settled early. Livestock shifted and exhaled steam into enclosed spaces. Their presence was practical, not sentimental. Shared warmth mattered. The twilight hour carried a particular stillness. It was not yet night, but no longer day. Sound traveled differently then. Footsteps echoed more sharply. Voices seemed louder than intended, so people spoke less. This was often when Christmas preparations took their quietest form. Not feasts yet, not celebration, but readiness. Food was checked. Leftovers were covered. Bread was wrapped carefully to keep from drying in the cold air. Water was drawn and stored before freezing could claim it. You would feel the cold first in your hands at this hour, fingers stiffening slightly as you worked. A dull ache that reminded you not to linger outdoors longer than necessary. The body learned these signals early in life, responding without panic. Children, especially, learned to recognize the change. They stayed closer to adults. Movement slowed. Games faded into quiet observation. The shortening day taught patience as much as it taught caution. In castles, twilight behaved differently. Thick walls delayed the arrival of darkness inside certain rooms, while others plunged into shadow early. Corridors cooled unevenly. Stairwells drew cold downward, funneling it through the structure. Guards and servants knew these patterns well, adjusting their routes and duties accordingly. Fires were checked, but not yet fully fed. This was a time for banking embers, not building flames. A fire that burned too brightly too early would leave nothing but ash later when it was needed most. So people waited. They allowed twilight to pass naturally. This waiting was not empty. It was attentive. Eyes adjusted. Ears picked up subtle sounds. The mind shifted into a slower rhythm, one that matched the pace of winter itself. By the time true darkness arrived, most households were already gathered. Doors were secured. Shutters closed where possible. Curtains, if they existed, were drawn more for drafts than privacy. The cold pressed closer now, testing seams and corners. But this was expected. There was comfort in expectation. Winter nights did not surprise those who had lived through many of them. Christmas, in this context, was not a break from winter, but part of it. The shortened days framed the holiday, reminding everyone that endurance came first. Celebration followed only after safety was assured. As twilight faded completely, the world outside disappeared into darkness. Inside, small islands of light remained. Firelight, a single candle, a reflection off polished metal or glazed pottery. These were enough, more than enough. The body began its nightly adjustment. Shoulders hunched slightly. Hands sought warmth instinctively. Breathing slowed as movement decreased. Fatigue was not resisted. It was accepted as a guide. This was how winter nights were entered, quietly, deliberately, without struggle. And as the last trace of day vanished, people did not mourn it. They had already learned how to live without it. Once the last traces of daylight had slipped away, the cold no longer lingered politely at the edges of the home. It moved inward. Indoors, the change was subtle at first. The air grew heavier, less willing to move. Warmth from bodies and fires remained close, hovering near benches, beds, and hearths, while the rest of the room slowly cooled. There was no sharp line between comfort and cold, only a gradual tightening, a quiet reminder that winter did not stop at the threshold. Stone walls, so strong and dependable, were also patient collectors of chill. Throughout the day, they had absorbed cold from the ground and night air beyond them. Now, as evening deepened, they released it steadily into the room. Floors grew cold first, then the lower walls. Finally, the air itself seemed to thin, making every breath feel slightly sharper. People knew this pattern well. They adjusted without comment. Furniture was moved closer to heat sources. Benches and stools were drawn inward. Bed coverings were layered carefully. Wool over linen, fur where it could be spared. These were not hurried actions, but practiced ones, refined through generations of observation. You would notice the cold most clearly when you stopped moving. A hand resting on a table too long, feet still against stone. The body responded quietly, encouraging small shifts, crossing ankles, tucking hands beneath fabric, leaning closer to others. Firelight became the center of the room, not because it was bright, but because it was reliable. Flames were kept modest. Large fires were costly, consuming precious wood too quickly. Instead, embers were encouraged to glow steadily, offering slow, lasting warmth. The air carried familiar scents: smoke, damp wool, stored grain. These smells changed slightly as the temperature dropped, growing heavier, more enclosed. Windows, where they existed, were sealed as tightly as possible, yet thin drafts still crept in. They followed predictable paths, beneath doors, along shutters, through cracks no one bothered repairing until spring. In larger buildings, like manor houses or castles, cold behaved unevenly. Some chambers remained tolerable longer than others. Upper floors often grew colder faster, exposed to wind and night air. Stairwells acted like channels, pulling cold downward into central halls. Servants and guards understood these currents instinctively, choosing where to linger and where to pass through quickly. Children learned early which places were safe to sit and which were not. A stone bench against an outer wall might look inviting, but it drew warmth away relentlessly. Better to sit on chests, on bedding, or close to animals, whose steady heat softened the cold around them. Animals indoors were part of winter design. Dogs curled tightly at feet. Cats pressed against walls warmed by fires. Livestock below living quarters added a gentle, constant warmth that rose through floorboards. This was not indulgence. It was survival through shared heat. As the hours passed, the cold continued its work. Breath remained visible near walls. Water left uncovered developed a thin skin of ice. Fingers stiffened more easily, movements becoming economical and deliberate. Sleep, when it came, arrived slowly. Beds were cold at first, stealing warmth until bodies warmed the layers beneath them. People shifted, settling into positions that minimized exposure. Backs turned toward walls, knees drawn slightly inward, heads covered just enough to trap warmth without blocking breath. You would feel this moment clearly, the point when the room was no longer warming, only holding steady. Fire stopped adding heat and began merely maintaining it. From then on, comfort depended on stillness. Conversation faded, not because people were tired of speaking, but because sound felt intrusive in the cold. Silence carried warmth better. Each movement disturbed the air, letting cold flow back in. Christmas night did not change this rhythm. If anything, it sharpened awareness of it. The promise of a holy day tomorrow did not soften the present reality. Celebration waited. Endurance came first. In wealthier households, extra tapestries were hung along walls to trap warmth. In humbler homes, sacks of straw or spare fabric served the same purpose. Nothing was wasted. Even thin barriers made a difference when cold pressed steadily from all sides. Time slowed indoors. Without strong light, without distraction, people became aware of small changes. The settling of wood, the soft crack of embers, the rhythm of breathing nearby. These sounds became reassuring markers of life continuing. Some drifted into half-sleep, waking briefly to adjust a blanket or move closer to warmth. Others remained lightly alert, especially those responsible for tending fires. Their vigilance was calm, habitual, not anxious. This was the heart of winter living. Not resistance, but cooperation. Cold was acknowledged, accommodated, and quietly endured. By fully settling indoors, people gave themselves the best chance to last the night. The walls might steal heat, the air might grow thin and sharp, but routine held firm. The cold had arrived, and everyone knew exactly how to meet it. By the time night fully settled, the body had already begun to change its habits. Preparation for the long winter night was not dramatic or deliberate in any formal sense. It happened quietly through small adjustments learned over a lifetime. People did not speak of preparing the body, but they understood instinctively that night demanded cooperation from flesh and bone as much as from walls and fire. Movement slowed first. Tasks that could wait were left undone. Tools were set aside carefully. Hands, already stiff from cold, avoided unnecessary effort. There was an economy to motion, each step taken with purpose, each gesture measured. The body conserved warmth not through tension, but through restraint. Meals, when taken, were modest and grounding. Warm foods, even simple ones, helped settle the stomach and offered brief comfort. Thick broths, coarse bread, or porridge warmed hands as much as they nourished the body. Eating slowly allowed warmth to spread gradually, easing muscles and quieting the mind. Afterward, people lingered near heat just long enough to absorb what they could. Faces turned toward the hearth. Palms opened briefly to the fire before being tucked away again. This was not indulgence. It was calibration, bringing the body to a state that would endure the night without shock. Clothing was adjusted carefully. Day garments were loosened, heavier layers added where needed. Wool was favored for its ability to retain warmth even when damp. Linen lay closest to the skin, soft and familiar. Nothing was worn too tightly. Circulation mattered. Too much pressure invited numbness. You would feel this moment distinctly, the quiet awareness of your own body as it settled. Muscles eased. Breath slowed. The warmth you carried became something to guard rather than expend. Beds, such as they were prepared with equal care. Straw was fluffed to trap air. Blankets were shaken, then layered deliberately. Furs were placed where the cold would bite first, along feet, legs, and backs pressed against walls. People slept clothed. Always. Even the wealthy did not remove layers unnecessarily. Night demanded readiness, not comfort. Shoes might be loosened, but kept within reach. Cloaks lay folded nearby, not far from the hand. Children were positioned carefully between adults, sharing warmth through proximity. The elderly were given the most sheltered places, away from drafts, closer to heat sources, surrounded by bodies when possible. These arrangements were rarely discussed. They were understood. As the house or hall grew quieter, the body's final preparations unfolded internally. Digestion slowed. Limbs cooled gradually. The mind loosened its grip on alertness, allowing awareness to soften without fully surrendering. Sleep came in stages. First, a shallow drifting, punctuated by small adjustments, tucking hands beneath arms, drawing knees inward, pulling coverings higher. Then, longer stretches of stillness, broken only by shifts prompted by cold creeping too close. You would notice how sound changed as well. The crackle of embers seemed louder, the settling of wood more distinct. Even distant wind felt nearer, pressing gently against the structure. These sounds anchored the body, reminding it that it was not alone, that the world continued to hold. Breathing deepened, though never fully relaxed. In winter, sleep was watchful by necessity. Bodies learned to rest lightly, ready to respond to discomfort or danger without fully waking. This kind of sleep was not restorative in a modern sense. It was functional. It preserved life. It allowed endurance to stretch across long hours of darkness without exhaustion claiming too much ground. For many, prayer or quiet reflection marked the final conscious moments. Not always spoken aloud, sometimes simply felt. Ritual brought order to uncertainty, a sense that the night, however cold, had boundaries. Christmas, approaching or already begun, depending on the calendar, added little warmth but much meaning. The promise of light returning, both literal and symbolic, offered reassurance. Not excitement, just steadiness. As bodies finally settled, heat slowly equalized. The warmth people carried became shared warmth, spreading gently through layers and bodies pressed close. The room, though still cold, stabilized. This was the goal. Not comfort, stability. Once reached, stillness became the greatest ally. Movement invited cold. Silence preserved warmth. The night stretched ahead, long and quiet, but manageable. Preparation was complete. The body, the room, and the rhythm of winter had aligned, ready to endure what darkness would bring. Cold rarely announced itself with urgency. It arrived gradually, almost politely, allowing the body time to adjust. This was its most dangerous quality. It did not strike like a blow. It settled like a presence that stayed too long. In the hours after darkness fully claimed the land, cold began its slow work. It moved inward from the edges of the body. Fingers, toes, ears, the tip of the nose. These parts cooled first, not because they were weak, but because the body chose to protect what lay deeper. Blood withdrew quietly. Circulation favored the core. Muscles at the extremities lost warmth little by little, becoming stiff, then dull. The sensation was not pain at first. It was absence, a fading awareness. You would notice it most clearly in stillness. As long as someone moved, stirring the fire, shifting position, adjusting bedding, the cold seemed manageable. But once motion ceased, the temperature made its intentions known. Cold crept into joints. It pressed against skin through layers of wool and linen. It waited patiently for the body to relax. Breath changed too. Each exhale carried warmth away. Each inhale brought air that felt heavier, sharper. Over time, breathing grew shallower without conscious decision, an instinctive effort to preserve heat. Inside homes, the cold behaved differently than outdoors. Stone walls absorbed chill during the day, and released it slowly at night. Wooden structures creaked as they contracted. Floors drew warmth downward, leaving feet cold even beneath coverings. Fire helped, but imperfectly. A hearth warmed only what it touched. Beyond its reach, shadows held cold tightly. Even near the flames, warmth fluctuated. Brief comfort followed by cooling once embers dimmed. Night demanded patience with these cycles. Cold affected the mind as much as the body. Thoughts slowed. Attention narrowed. The world felt smaller, contained within the space immediately around the sleeper. Long-term worries faded, replaced by simple awareness. Warmth here, cold there, stillness good, movement costly. This mental quiet was not peace. It was conservation. People learned not to fight cold directly. Resistance wasted energy. Instead, they adapted, minimizing exposure, limiting motion, accepting discomfort without panic. Endurance came from cooperation, not struggle. Sleep became fragmented. Rather than a single long rest, it unfolded in intervals. Light sleep, brief waking, adjustment, then drifting again. This pattern allowed the body to respond before cold became dangerous. It was an ancient rhythm, shaped by necessity rather than choice. You might wake without fully waking. Eyes closed, mind dimly aware, simply to tuck a hand deeper beneath a blanket or draw knees closer to the chest. Then, just as quietly, you would sink back into rest. Cold punished neglect slowly. A foot left uncovered did not suffer immediately. It cooled, numbed, then faded from awareness. This was the risk. Loss of sensation invited stillness, and stillness allowed cold to deepen its hold. Communal sleeping helped counter this. Shared warmth created a buffer against gradual heat loss. Bodies acted as living embers, sustaining one another through proximity. Those alone faced greater challenge. Solitary sleepers learned to curl inward, protecting vital areas. They arranged bedding carefully, built small barriers against drafts, and relied heavily on routine. Habit compensated where shared warmth was absent. Cold also changed time. Minutes stretched, hours blurred. The night felt longer than it was. Without light or sound to mark progress, the body measured time through sensation. The rise and fall of warmth, the stiffness of limbs, the shifting quality of breath. Morning was not anticipated with excitement. It was awaited with steadiness. Survival through the night was its own quiet achievement. During Christmas season, this slow struggle was familiar. The festival did not suspend winter's rules. Instead, it existed alongside them. Celebration happened within constraint, shaped by cold rather than insulated from it. Cold did not care for calendars. It treated all nights alike, demanding attention, patience, and respect. Those who endured understood this deeply. They did not curse the cold. They learned it. By yielding to its pace, they preserved themselves. As the night continued, cold remained present but predictable. Once its patterns were known, fear diminished. What replaced it was vigilance, a gentle, persistent awareness that guarded life through stillness. This was how cold worked, not through sudden harm, but through time. Sleep was necessary, and yet it was also the most uncertain moment of the night. Before warmth could be summoned at will, before light erased the dark with a switch, sleep carried quiet risk. Not because it was feared, but because it loosened attention. And in winter, attention itself was a form of protection. As the body surrendered to rest, control softened. Muscles relaxed. Breathing slowed. The instinct to adjust position faded. It was in this surrender that cold gained its greatest advantage. People understood this without words. They knew that staying awake forever was impossible, but they also knew that falling too deeply, too quickly, could be dangerous. Sleep had to be allowed carefully, in stages, with preparation and habit guiding the body into safety. This was why the moments before rest mattered so much. The body was positioned deliberately, knees drawn inward, arms folded close, blankets tucked not for comfort alone, but to seal warmth where it mattered most. Gaps were closed, drafts anticipated. Nothing was left to chance. Even posture was learned knowledge. Lying flat exposed the chest. Stretching outward invited heat loss. Curling inward protected organs and shortened the body's surface area. These choices were not conscious each night. They were taught by winter's past, remembered in muscle rather than mind. Sleep came gradually. At first, there was only stillness. Eyes closed, but awareness hovering. The body listened to the wind, to the faint crackle of embers, to the sound of others breathing nearby. These sounds anchored the sleeper, signaling that life continued around them. Only then did deeper rest begin, but it rarely lasted uninterrupted. The cold itself became a signal. When warmth thinned, the body responded with subtle alarms. A tightening of muscles, a shallow shift of breath, a half-waking that barely reached the mind. You might not remember waking at all. You would only remember being warmer again. This pattern repeated through the night. Sleep broke and reformed. Rest was layered, not continuous. And while it may sound exhausting, it was how people survived. Stillness was dangerous when it became complete. Those who slept too deeply risked not noticing the gradual numbing of extremities. Fingers could stiffen unnoticed. Toes could lose sensation entirely. And when sensation disappeared, movement often stopped as well. This was why shared spaces mattered so much. In group sleeping, movement by one stirred the rest. A shift, a cough, a quiet adjustment rippled outward, gently waking others just enough to reposition themselves. Sleep remained collective, protective. Children were watched closely. Their sleep was deeper, their bodies smaller. They were tucked between adults, surrounded by warmth and watchfulness. Mothers and elders woke instinctively to adjust a blanket, draw a child closer, press a hand against cold skin to restore warmth. These actions were quiet, practiced, nearly automatic. No one spoke of fear. Instead, they spoke of care. Among adults, sleep was a contract with the night. You gave yourself to it, but not fully. You trusted habit to wake you when needed. You trusted your body to remember what your mind no longer tracked. Fire complicated this relationship. A hearth offered comfort, but also temptation. People slept closer to flames than was ideal, seeking warmth that would not last. As embers dimmed, the surrounding air cooled quickly, sometimes more sharply than the steady cold elsewhere. Waking from that sudden loss of warmth was jarring. Yet even then, panic was rare. Panic wasted energy. Calm response mattered more. A blanket drawn tighter. A position shifted. Perhaps someone rose briefly to stir coals, if fuel allowed. More often, they endured without flame. Sleep in winter was never complete escape. Dreams were shallow. The mind did not wander far. Even in rest, part of the body remained alert, guarding against the slow creep of cold. This vigilance did not feel stressful. It felt normal. People were accustomed to sleeping lightly, to waking often, to resting in pieces rather than wholes. Their nights were long, but not empty. They were filled with these quiet adjustments, these small acts of preservation. Some nights were harder. Illness, exhaustion, hunger, all made sleep more dangerous. A weakened body struggled to generate heat. A tired mind slipped more easily into deep rest. These were the nights when care from others mattered most. Someone always listened, not intently, not anxiously, but with the awareness born of shared survival. The night belonged to everyone, and everyone bore responsibility for greeting the morning. This was the quiet truth of winter sleep. Not dramatic, not heroic, just careful, and careful was enough. In the long nights of winter, not every body met the cold in the same way. Some bodies were small, some were worn thin by years, some were already struggling before the night began. And in households shaped by stone, timber, and habit, these differences were understood without explanation. Children slept differently. Their warmth came and went more quickly. Their limbs cooled faster. Their sleep was deeper, less responsive to subtle changes in temperature. This made them both resilient and vulnerable at the same time. They were placed carefully, never near doors, never close to bare stone, often between adults, where heat lingered longest and movement was most frequent. Blankets were layered over them first, furs tucked higher along their shoulders. caps pulled low to cover ears and temples, where heat escaped easily. At night, adults woke to them without fully waking. A child's breath slowing too much, a foot grown cold, a restless turn. Hands reached out instinctively. A body shifted closer. Warmth was shared without words. This attention was not anxious. It was practiced, passed down through generations of winters that taught what mattered. Children rarely remembered these moments. They slept through the care that kept them safe. The elderly experienced the night differently. Their bodies no longer held heat as they once had. Muscles were thinner, circulation slower. Joints stiffened quickly in the cold, making movement difficult once stillness set in. For them, sleep came lightly and often did not stay. They woke more often, not always knowing why, only sensing discomfort, chill, or unease. Rising to adjust a blanket could be painful. Shifting position took effort, and yet they endured these interruptions quietly. Elders were often positioned near the heart of the household, not out of sentiment alone, but practicality. Where people gathered during the day, warmth lingered longest into the night. Where the hearth had burned hours earlier, stone held memory of heat. Even a small difference mattered. The elderly were watched with subtle respect. Someone noticed if they shivered. Someone offered a place closer. Someone rose earlier to stir embers before stiffness became unbearable. This care was mutual. Those same elders carried knowledge. How to layer bedding properly, how to block drafts, how to read the sound of wind through gaps. Their presence strengthened survival, even when their bodies weakened. The weak were not always obvious. Illness moved quietly in winter. Coughs lingered. Fevers came and went. Hunger softened strength before it showed on the face. A person might lie down appearing well enough, only to struggle more deeply as the night progressed. These were the nights when sleep became most dangerous. A body already taxed could not spare energy for heat. Shivering took strength it did not have. Rest, meant to restore, sometimes drained what little remained. And yet the household adapted. Those who were unwell were not left alone. They slept closer to others. Fires were tended longer if possible. Warm drinks were saved for them, even when supplies were thin. Care was rationed carefully, but not withheld. No one spoke of outcomes. They spoke of comfort, of warmth, of rest. If someone did not wake, it was not framed as failure. It was understood as part of winter's quiet cost. Life continued, shaped gently around absence, with rituals that allowed grief to exist without overwhelming the living. This acceptance did not make loss easier, but it made survival steadier. Children learned early what winter meant, not through fear, but through observation. They learned to sleep curled, to keep hands tucked, to listen for changes in the room. These lessons settled into the body long before they were spoken aloud. The elderly, too, accepted winter's demands. They rested when they could, conserved movement, shared stories in the dim hours before sleep. Not to entertain, but to slow the mind, steady the breath, and prepare the body for stillness. The weak were folded into the rhythm. No one was rushed. No one was scolded for needing more warmth, more rest, more care. Winter stripped life down to essentials, and compassion was one of them. In these nights, survival was not individual. It was communal. Heat was shared. Vigilance rotated. Sleep was layered across the household like the blankets themselves. Thin in places, thicker where needed most. This is how people endured nights when fire faded, when darkness pressed close, when the cold asked more than comfort could easily give. They did not resist the night. They adjusted to it. And in that adjustment, quiet, repetitive, patient, they carried children into morning, supported the elderly through another dawn, and gave the weak their best chance to remain among the living. Even in the deepest hours, when most slept fitfully or not at all, some remained awake, not out of curiosity, nor out of excitement, but simply because the cold demanded it, and the structure of the castle required it. Guards moved quietly through stone corridors, their steps deliberate, measured. The echoes of footsteps were absorbed gradually by thick walls, and the sound itself became part of the rhythm of night, a slow, constant punctuation in the otherwise hushed chambers. Fires, too, were never entirely abandoned. In select rooms and hallways, embers glowed faintly, feeding on the last logs from evening. They were tended with care, poked gently, fanned, or added to with small twigs. Each motion was unhurried, as if hurried movement would disturb the delicate balance of warmth. The glow illuminated stone faces, wooden beams, and the occasional tapestry, but never fully banished shadow. Darkness lingered in corners, in stairwells, in areas where warmth could not yet reach. The contrast was subtle, a soft dance of light and shadow, which marked time without urgency. Guards made their rounds slowly, noticing small details that others might have missed. A crack in the floor that allowed a draft. A panel of door slightly ajar. The rise and fall of breath, both theirs and others. Movement was deliberate, almost meditative. These were acts performed not for heroism, but for preservation. One step too fast could waste energy. One shout too loud could disturb those nearby. Every adjustment was minimal, efficient, and respectful of the night's rhythm. In rooms where fires burned faintly, the warmth was uneven. The hearths radiated heat only to the immediate area. In distant chambers, stone remained cold, holding onto hours of earlier chill. The human body, however, adapted. Guards and attendants moved slowly from room to room, carrying heat as they went. A hand brushed against stone to test its temperature. A blanket was shifted for a sleeper, almost imperceptibly. These gestures, small as they were, shaped survival. Cold was not a sudden foe. It arrived gradually, pressing into joints, slowing blood flow, stiffening fingers. The first hours after nightfall had been endured. Now, in these hours past midnight, the body's resilience was tested more subtly. Every movement required attention. Every adjustment of clothing, blanket, or posture contributed to sustaining warmth. Guards observed this rhythm closely, both for themselves and for those under their quiet charge. Time itself seemed altered. Hours expanded. Minutes melted slowly into one another. The quiet ticking of survival, the patter of embers, the occasional scraping of boots across stone, the subtle rustle of bedding, became the night's measure. One could tell how long it had been awake not by the hour, but by the change in body stiffness, the fading strength in hands and feet, the faint cloud of breath rising in cooler pockets of air. Observing these details was not laborious. It was habitual, almost instinctive, learned over years of similar nights. The watchmen were aware of other presences. Families, servants, animals, all existed within the same walls, sharing air, warmth, and attention. Each figure contributed to the rhythm, even in stillness. Footsteps were softened to avoid startling sleepers. Voices, if used, were low and careful, meant only to convey essential information. The night demanded patience, observation, and minimal interference. Fires required constant attention. A smoldering hearth could become a lifeline if tended correctly, or a quiet danger if neglected. Guards occasionally adjusted logs, ensuring that coals remained, not for brightness, but for steady, consistent warmth. The smell of burning would fill the air faintly, mixed with the cooler scent of stone and frost, a reminder of the thin line between comfort and exposure. The presence of these fires also offered reassurance, an anchor in the otherwise heavy, still night. In some halls, a solitary figure might sit or stand, barely moving, watching embers and shadows alike. The body becomes both observer and participant in its environment, moving only when necessary. Every adjustment, every micro-movement, conserved energy while subtly maintaining warmth. This was endurance without dramatics. The night's long hours demanded only quiet, consistent attention. The people who remained awake understood another truth. Survival was collective. Their actions, silent, gentle, and repetitive, ensured that families and the vulnerable could remain in warmth. Care was quiet. Observation was habitual. Vigilance was slow but constant. There was no fear, no rush, only an acceptance of the night's demands. They did not measure success in heroics, but in small continuities. The ember still glows, the sleeper stirs comfortably, the cold does not overtake. Even minor events required subtle response. A door creaking in a distant corridor could signal a shift in draft. The distant low sound of a sleeping child could indicate need for adjustment. A faint hiss from an ember's edge required minimal attention. In all these instances, movement was deliberate, almost invisible. The goal was to maintain equilibrium, to allow heat to persist, to preserve the household through the hours when cold ruled and sleep pressed heavily against consciousness. By observing and sustaining these small necessities, the guards and attendants upheld more than just comfort. They upheld the continuity of life. The night's challenges, frost, stone, draft, and fatigue, were not met with struggle or alarm, but with patience, subtle adjustment, and quiet presence. In this way, the human body and household functioned together, harmonizing with the stone and air to endure what would otherwise be insurmountable. As the night deepened, the castle settled into a profound stillness. Yet stillness was never complete. The wind, persistent and indifferent, pressed against stone walls and slanted roofs. It whispered through narrow arrow slits, swirled around corner towers, and sometimes found its way along stairwells or under doors. The sound was never harsh. It was soft, persistent, a subtle reminder of the cold beyond the thick walls. For those awake, it became a measure of the night's passing. How long had they remained attentive? How cold had their bodies become? And how the stone itself held the chill. Frost, too, had its quiet presence. On window panes, thin patterns of ice etched themselves slowly, catching what little light the moon provided. The breath of those within mingled with this frost, briefly clouding the air, only to vanish moments later. In places where fires had not yet reached, floors retained a frozen hardness, compelling careful steps or the layering of furs. Each sound, footstep, rustle of fabric, crackle of embers, was amplified in these quiet, cold spaces. Awareness of these small details was essential, for even the faintest oversight could allow the cold to press further into the body. Time stretched and shifted. Minutes blended into one another. A crack in a stone wall sounded louder in the near silence. Distant howls of wind became rhythm, almost like a song repeated without variation. This monotony, rather than being uncomfortable, offered a hypnotic pace that guided consciousness gently between alertness and drowsiness. Listeners, tucked in closer to hearths or in bedrolls, might notice every subtle sound without tension, learning to let the body respond slowly and deliberately. Outside the main halls, the air pressed against every gap. Towers, stairwells, and corridors formed conduits for the wind, shaping currents that could chill the skin in a single, slow sweep. Guards and those awake moved with careful intention, adjusting cloaks, fur-lined garments, and blankets. Each movement was minimal, conserving energy while countering the subtle intrusion of cold. Even small gestures, curling hands, shifting feet, turning the head, could reduce the effects of wind entering through an open slit or drafty doorway. In this environment, awareness of sound, movement, and temperature became almost meditative, a gentle engagement with the forces of the night. The interplay between frost and warmth was delicate. Fires in the hearth radiated uneven heat. Corners remained sharp with cold. In these places, the tiniest sound were significant. A blanket shifting, a step across stone, or the whisper of a door could signal the need for adjustment. The cold had its own patience, its own subtle insistence. It was not a sudden danger, but a quiet, persistent presence that required habitual vigilance. Humans, in turn, adapted slowly, learning to move and react with minimal effort, preserving both warmth and energy for the hours ahead. Even breathing became part of this nocturnal rhythm. Exhaled air formed clouds in colder corners, then dissipated. The sound of one's own breath, steady and shallow, offered reassurance. Nearby, others' breathing added layers to the ambient atmosphere. The the soft huff of a child sleeping, the measured exhale of an elder, the careful intake of a guard alert to drafts and temperature changes. These sounds, subtle yet constant, created a shared rhythm, a quiet chorus that affirmed presence, endurance, and survival without urgency or alarm. Patience dominated the night. There was no hurry, no expectation of activity beyond what was necessary. A guard might pause at a frozen window to observe the patterns of frost, noting its slow expansion and contraction as temperatures shifted. A servant might listen to the soft creaking of beams, anticipating how drafts might travel. Even the faintest sound, a settling stone, a whisper of wind, was absorbed and interpreted not with fear, but with gentle attentiveness. Every observation reinforced a cycle of survival that was deliberate, habitual, and calming. Time perception became elastic. Hours could pass without much change, and yet small adjustments, the fanning of embers, the shifting of furs, the repositioning of a hand near warmth, marked the progression of the night. Listeners might imagine themselves wrapped in layers, attentive to small changes in temperature and sound, feeling the slow passage of time as the wind pressed against stone and frost accumulated silently. Awareness was passive but continuous, a subtle engagement that fostered both endurance and sleepiness. The cold was relentless, yet not oppressive. It was quiet, persistent, shaping movements, habits, and attention. Snow, ice, or frost might cling to exterior walls, but inside, subtle variations in temperature guided behavior. Those awake adapted, learning when to move, when to remain still, and when to adjust bedding or garments. Each action was measured, deliberate, and repetitive, offering reassurance that endurance was manageable, that survival through the night was guided by patience rather than urgency. Even the smallest sounds were part of the night's education. Footsteps, creaks of wood, distant whispers, the gentle sigh of fabric, and the faint hiss of embers combined to create an environment of quiet awareness. Sleep was possible only when the mind synchronized with these rhythms, allowing the body to relax into habitual patterns of response. The wind, frost, and subtle noises were companions, not adversaries, guiding humans to move gently, breathe slowly, and preserve warmth without conscious effort. In this long, cold span, one learned that survival depended on harmony with environment. The wind, frost, and sound were constant teachers, demonstrating the need for patience, careful attention, and repeated, small movements. Those awake in the castle did not battle the elements in sudden bursts. They endured them in rhythm, attuned to the quiet, subtle demands of stone, air, and cold. By moving deliberately, listening attentively, and responding softly, they maintained equilibrium throughout the night, fostering both endurance and the possibility of restful sleep. As the first hints of night's end approached, though still hours away, the patterns established in the deep cold and quiet persisted. Awareness of wind, frost, and sound continued to guide movements and attention. The human body, slowly adapting to long hours of quiet endurance, had learned to preserve heat, anticipate drafts, and respond gently to environmental changes. It was a world defined by patience, subtlety, and quiet, unhurried observation. A perfect setting for a listener to drift, slowly, toward the calm rhythm of slumber. The hours between 1 and 4 in the morning were the most quietly demanding. They were the deep core of the night, when the cold had fully settled and the castle's stone and timber retained its sharp chill. In these hours, the body itself seemed to weigh more, every movement requiring conscious attention, every adjustment of blankets or fur lining deliberate and careful. The rhythm of the night, established earlier through gentle vigilance and small motions, became almost hypnotic, stretching time into a slow, measurable passage. Breath was more visible in certain rooms, curling in the still, frosty air and fading as it mingled with the chill that had accumulated on the stone. Those awake noticed it, gently exhaling and inhaling, feeling warmth rise slightly in their chest before slipping away. Movement was minimized, conserving energy. A shift of a hand or foot was made slowly, almost imperceptibly, mindful of stiffness in joints dulled by hours of inactivity and the cold's slow creep. The mind, though awake, often drifted in measured intervals, hovering between alertness and the gentle pull of drowsiness, allowing for a soft, constant vigilance that was both restful and necessary. Outside, the wind and frost continued their quiet presence. Through arrow slits and thin windows, the night whispered against stone, creating subtle patterns of sound and movement. A door might creak when shifted, a beam might groan as it contracted in the cold. Yet these were not alarming. They were steady companions, markers of the passage of time and the unchanging environment. Each sound required minimal but deliberate acknowledgement, adjusting a cloak, drawing a blanket closer, flexing stiffened fingers. Survival was a matter of these careful, repeated gestures, not sudden action. Within the larger halls, faint embers glowed in hearths, their lights soft and intermittent. Servants, guards, and the few who remained awake moved slowly, coaxing the fire to last, tending to logs with gentle patience, blowing air quietly over embers to revive warmth. The faint hiss of smoke and the subtle crackle of burning would punctuated the long hours, offering reassurance that life continued and that the cold, though persistent, could be managed. Observing these motions was calming, even hypnotic, a reminder of human persistence in the face of environmental pressure. Bodies adapted slowly. Stiff joints loosened only with repeated, small movements. Muscles, dulled by cold and limited activity, were coaxed back into use with stretches of fingers, gentle rotations of wrists, subtle bends of knees. The rhythm of attention and adjustment created a slow, almost imperceptible routine. Breathe, shift, observe, wait. These actions repeated across hours, creating continuity and allowing sleep to drift in intermittent waves. Drowsiness arrived gently, then receded, never fully relinquishing the body to unconsciousness. In this way, endurance and rest coexisted, each dependent on the other. Time lost its usual meaning. Hours stretched quietly, measured only by the movement of embers, the occasional shift of a guard's stance, or the subtle change in frost patterns along the windows and floors. Even as drowsiness lured the mind towards sleep, the body retained a quiet awareness of its environment. Each draft, each cold corner, each soft sound was met with measured response, an automatic vigilance that required minimal effort yet maintained safety and warmth. The castle became a living, breathing space, its stone and timber shaping both motion and stillness, guiding inhabitants through the night without drama or urgency. Children and the elderly, when awake, contributed gently to the shared rhythm. A small stretch here, a careful repositioning of furs there, or a whispered adjustment near someone else's bedding helped maintain comfort and circulation. Every movement, though minor, had purpose: to conserve heat, to reduce stiffness, to prevent silent loss. The feigned awareness of others' presence reinforced a communal pattern of endurance, teaching the young through quiet observation and allowing the elderly to navigate the night with subtle, repeated care. The long middle hours also highlighted the interplay between the cold and the human body. Fingers and toes, the first to feel the chill, demanded attention. Wrists and ankles stiffened under layered garments, and shoulders and necks tensed as if holding in heat. Every subtle adjustment, a shift of a hand, curling a foot under a blanket, tucking a shoulder closer to warmth, was significant. The environment demanded patience, precision, and repetition. Comfort was never complete, yet survival was a measure of how small, consistent acts mitigated the cold over time. Sound remained a constant companion. The soft sigh of wind, distant groans of timber, crackle of embers, and the careful rustling of blankets all shaped the perception of night. Even silence had weight, measured against the presence of frost-laden stone and cold corridors. Sleep was punctuated, never deep, arriving in fragments and retreating slowly, allowing the body to maintain awareness while offering gentle, temporary respite. This delicate balance, the interplay of rest and vigilance, was the essence of enduring the long, cold hours before dawn. The body's responses were subtle but cumulative. Muscles relaxed when possible, then tensed when drafts pressed in. Breathing fluctuated between deeper, warming breaths and shorter, more careful inhalations. Heart rate slowed under the quiet monotony, conserving energy. Even posture became a tool, curling closer to blankets, leaning against warmer stones, or huddling near others' bodies in measured proximity. All these actions, repeated across the long middle hours, preserved warmth, comfort, and life without haste or dramatization. Time finally began to hint at its nearing shift, though hours still remained. The faintest changes in light or frost patterns were noted subconsciously, each marking the slow approach of morning. The long middle hours, however, retained their hypnotic consistency. They were a meditation on endurance, teaching patience, repetition, and the quiet maintenance of warmth and awareness. Listeners might drift alongside these rhythms, noticing subtle changes in sound, temperature, and movement, slowly aligning their own breathing and posture with a measured, comforting cadence of night-long survival. By the end of this period, the foundation of human endurance was evident. Survival was not heroism, and danger was not violent. It was the persistent, quiet pressure of cold and time, managed through routine, observation, and gentle repetition. The night had passed, yet was not yet complete. The long hours had taught endurance, subtle attentiveness, and the calm mastery of environment. For those listening, this extended focus on rhythm, sound, and small movements offers both hypnotic relaxation and a gentle understanding of historical resilience. The middle of the night, though unremarkable to the casual eye, had been the crucible of calm survival. Every whisper of wind, every frost-laden surface, every crackle of fire, and every careful movement contributed to the maintenance of warmth, the preservation of comfort, and the quiet protection of life. It was an enduring, hypnotic lesson in patience, care, and the human ability to thrive in stillness, framed by the subtle pressures of the medieval castle night. As the hours slowly edged toward the first hints of morning, the castle's occupants remained deeply attuned to the subtle rhythms of the long night. Shared warmth had become not merely a comfort, but a quiet necessity. The cold, which had crept steadily along stone floors and up through timbered walls, dictated posture, placement, and proximity. Those who slept together or near one another had discovered the simple principle that warmth, like light, could be collected and preserved through careful arrangement. Bodies huddled in layered furs, blankets tucked tightly around limbs, shoulders drawn near the heat of another's chest. The practice was gentle, habitual, and deliberate, never rushed, never frantic, and always mindful of others' movements. The architecture of the castle, often so imposing and seemingly indifferent, had shaped human behavior through its very coldness. Narrow chambers, stone floors, and towering ceilings created drafts and pockets of frost that made positioning paramount. Beds were not merely for rest. They were stations of survival. Those on higher levels experienced more penetrating cold, and so adjustments were made. Heavier furs were layered, smaller children were moved closer to warmer adults, and sleeping positions were rotated slowly, almost imperceptibly, to distribute body heat efficiently. Every adjustment was small, but cumulative, the product of centuries of habit distilled into practical survival. Animals, too, played a subtle but important role. Cats curled around ankles, dogs pressed against the sides of those who could spare room, and chickens or small livestock huddled in lower chambers, their presence radiating faint warmth. People learned early to accommodate these silent companions, weaving them into the gentle choreography of warmth retention. A small hand resting on the back of a cat, a foot tucked near a dog. These seemingly minor gestures provided incremental warmth and comfort, a quiet reassurance that the night's endurance was shared, not borne alone. Each individual's movements were slow, almost ceremonial. Shifts in position were deliberate and carefully measured to avoid disturbing others. A slight rotation of the torso, a curling of the knees, a minor adjustment of layered blankets. Each act contributed to collective warmth. The body itself became a sensitive instrument, attuned to temperature differences, drafts, and the presence of nearby companions. The mind, dulled by long hours of half-sleep and vigilance, registered these changes subtly, reinforcing awareness without awakening the sharper anxieties that cold might otherwise provoke. The quiet vigilance of the night persisted. Even while resting, individuals maintained a gentle attention to their surroundings. A draft seeping through an arrow slit might prompt a careful shift closer to the wall, or a faint hiss of air around a door encouraged a slight tightening of blankets. This ongoing, gentle monitoring ensured that no one remained in a dangerously cold position for long, that warmth was conserved, and that the household could persist through the remainder of the night with minimal discomfort. The vigilance was not tense or fearful. It was simply mindful, habitual, and continuous. Children, particularly, learned through this routine. Observing adults and older siblings, they absorbed the quiet choreography of warmth sharing. Hands were placed gently to touch another's arm or leg, small bodies tucked into layers of furs, and soft whispers guided adjustments without disturbing the larger stillness of the room. In this way, the lessons of endurance, spatial awareness, and collective care were transmitted naturally, forming a subtle education in survival that required no words of instruction, only careful observation and quiet imitation. Sleep itself remained light and fragmented. The cold continued to press against bodies, encouraging intermittent movements and micro-adjustments. Muscles, stiffened by long hours of limited activity, were coaxed gently into use by the necessity of shifting for warmth. Fingers, toes, and shoulders responded slowly, each movement deliberate and precise. This slow, steady rhythm created a hypnotic repetition. Breathe, shift, adjust, wait. The body learned to move with the cold rather than against it, conserving energy while maintaining a low, steady level of warmth. In shared rooms, the placement of individuals reflected both social structure and practical considerations. Elders, who often generated less warmth and were more vulnerable to drafts, were positioned near multiple sources of heat, such as clustered fires or groups of sleeping companions. Children were frequently nestled between adults or siblings, learning the patterns of warmth distribution while receiving the most protection possible. The combination of instinct, habit, and gentle observation ensured that every person benefited from proximity and careful positioning without words or overt instruction. Survival was a quiet collaboration, performed with patience and mindfulness. The texture and weight of bedding played its own role in comfort and endurance. Layers of wool, fur, and thick cloth absorbed heat gradually, releasing it slowly through the night. Blankets were tucked, folded, and repositioned in subtle, repetitive motions, each adjustment reinforcing warmth in a controlled, intentional manner. The combination of natural materials, careful layering, and shared body heat allowed the occupants to endure hours of persistent cold while retaining enough comfort to drift in and out of sleep. The ritual itself became soothing, a gentle rhythm of endurance and care. Even the smallest movements held significance. A slight nudge to reposition a child, the gentle rotation of a blanket, the soft adjustment of a dog or cat nestled nearby. Each act reinforced the collective warmth and the enduring sense of safety. The body's awareness of its environment remained heightened, yet the alertness was measured, calm, and persistent. Over time, these small gestures compounded, producing a subtle but effective protection against the pervasive chill that had become such a defining feature of the night. By the end of these shared hours, a sense of continuity had been established. The castle's occupants had maintained life and warmth through coordinated, habitual movements that required neither urgency nor drama. They had developed an almost unconscious choreography, a sequence of shifts, adjustments, and positioning that preserved the body's heat and reduced the night's threat to a manageable rhythm. The cold remained, but it was softened by the patient and methodical application of endurance, care, and shared warmth. The lessons of this period, awareness, careful observation, gentle adjustment, would carry the household through the remaining night until the first signs of dawn emerged. In these quiet moments, listeners can sense the interplay of stone, fire, and human bodies, all engaged in a delicate, ongoing negotiation of comfort and survival. There is no sudden drama, no heroic act, only the slow, patient cultivation of warmth, the gentle repetition of gestures, and the quiet presence of others. It is a meditation on endurance, a soft and hypnotic reflection on how human beings have long adapted to cold, dark nights, relying not on force, but on careful attention, shared presence, and the steady rhythm of small, purposeful acts. As the night wore on and the cold pressed steadily against the stone walls, the inhabitants of the castle relied not only on physical strategies to preserve warmth, but also on the quiet constancy of belief and habit. These practices were rarely dramatic. They were subtle, almost imperceptible routines that had developed over generations, repeated night after night. Prayer, ritual, and small habitual movements created a rhythm that, though understated, reinforced both mental and physical endurance. The human mind, in concert with the body, responded to these cues, finding solace and structure amidst the persistent chill and darkness. In many rooms, faint murmurs of prayer or whispered verses accompanied the gentle rustling of blankets and shifting bodies. The cadence was soft and measured, more like a quiet chant than an urgent call. Some placed hands upon the hearth, feeling the last ember's warmth, and offered gratitude or whispered hopes for the morning's safety. Others drew the edges of blankets closer, aligning the body in patterns passed down through custom. These habits, while simple, provided a reassuring structure, a sense of control over circumstances that otherwise could feel overwhelmingly cold and unyielding. Repetition was central to survival. Movements were repeated with almost hypnotic precision. A slight adjustment of a blanket, a small shift to press closer to a companion, a gentle rotation of the body to redistribute warmth. Even when the cold seemed relentless, the familiar patterns of habit offered a subtle psychological anchor. The body, attuned to these movements, responded with efficiency, preserving heat and energy, maintaining a delicate equilibrium. Each small act, performed quietly and deliberately, became both protective and calming. Belief, too, had its place. Inhabitants often drew upon spiritual or communal traditions to lend comfort. Lighting a small candle, murmuring a prayer, or silently acknowledging the cycles of the seasons and the enduring structure of the castle helped maintain focus and composure. These acts were quiet, lacking any spectacle, but they provided a mental framework that reinforced endurance. Listeners might imagine these practices as soft beacons of reassurance, guiding the mind through hours of fatigue and dim light, as bodies adjusted to the cold with a rhythm that was steady and patient. In shared chambers, the interplay between habit and human presence was evident. Children, observing adults, absorbed the subtleties of movement, learning to shift gently for warmth, to recognize the signs of drafts, and to integrate into the collective routines of endurance. Elders, in turn, drew upon long experience, guiding movements and offering quiet instruction without words, their presence alone setting a steady pace. This intergenerational dance created a network of subtle guidance, a careful choreography that reinforced comfort and survival through repetition and awareness. The passage of hours was measured not in clocks or candles, but in sensation and quiet observation. Muscles stiffened by cold were eased by small movements and careful stretching. Breathing, visible in the frigid air, became rhythmic, a subtle signal of life and warmth. Even the slow flicker of embers in a hearth offered a temporal anchor, marking intervals and reminding occupants of both their vulnerability and their ability to endure. The night extended, but within it, a soft, persistent structure emerged, formed from repeated gestures, quiet reflection, and the unspoken knowledge of countless nights survived before. Fatigue settled heavily across the body, but it was tempered by the familiarity of routine. Every minor adjustment, every habitual gesture, required minimal conscious thought, yet carried significant impact. Hands flexed to warm themselves or others. Legs and arms shifted to redistribute heat. Heads tilted and bodies curled with deliberate care. The patterns were repetitive, but in their repetition, they offered comfort. They reassured the mind that the environment, though harsh, could be navigated with care, patience, and quiet observation. The endurance of night was also a mental exercise. The mind learned to temper expectation, to slow its rhythm in step with the body's measured movements. Anticipation of dawn was distant and abstract, allowing the occupants to focus on the immediate, on subtle adjustments, on whispered prayers, on shared warmth. In this way, habit and belief intertwined, reinforcing a calm vigilance that did not tire the mind with drama, but kept it attentive, responsive, and gently anchored. For those in charge of early household duties, small tasks reinforced this rhythm. Adding a log to the hearth, adjusting furs, or quietly attending to animals was done without disturbance, almost imperceptibly. Each act maintained life and comfort without urgency, embedding practical endurance into the fabric of daily and nightly routines. Even the smallest gestures, tilting a blanket over a child, pressing an arm closer to a companion, were part of this ongoing cycle, quietly fortifying warmth and resilience. By this stage of the night, the castle itself seemed to participate in the rhythm. Stone walls, once icy and unforgiving, had begun to absorb the minimal heat radiating from small fires and bodies clustered together. Floors, cold and unyielding, transmitted a subtle warning of drafts, guiding minor positional shifts. The interplay between structure, habit, and belief formed a consistent, reassuring pattern. Small acts, repeated over hours, sustained life and warmth, allowing occupants to endure without alarm and to rest even while remaining partially vigilant. As hours passed, the repetition of these practices produced a gentle hypnotic effect. Listeners might imagine themselves observing, without pressure, the steady flow of motion, the soft whispers of ritual, and the slow, deliberate care of each occupant. This continuity fostered an internal rhythm, a calm awareness of time passing without urgency, a quiet understanding that survival was as much mental and habitual as it was physical. The night, though long and cold, became navigable through these small, persistent gestures, providing a hypnotic cadence that encouraged relaxation, mental calm, and eventual sleep. Even the awareness of mortality was integrated softly into these routines. Some did not wake again. One might note quietly, as a reflection on the fragility of life in these times, acknowledged without drama. Such thoughts were part of the background, a subtle layer that deepened the hypnotic effect rather than disturbing it. Survival was framed not in heroics, but in careful attention, patient habit, and the gentle embrace of shared warmth and quiet belief. As the night slowly inched toward its later hours, the castle's occupants persisted through these intertwined practices. Belief, habit, and endurance reinforced one another, sustaining mind and body alike. Each minor gesture, each whispered prayer, each shift of the body within layered furs contributed to the quiet rhythm of the long night. In this way, the early hours before dawn were not endured in isolation, but navigated through centuries of accumulated knowledge, collective memory, and subtle human ingenuity. As the first tender traces of dawn began to seep along the thick castle walls, a quiet shift marked the end of the long, cold night. The darkness that had enveloped corridors, chambers, and halls gradually softened, revealing stone surfaces muted in the pale, gray light. Shadows that had once seemed inescapable receded gently, and the faint outlines of tapestries, Wooden beams and worn furniture became discernible. Light did not burst in suddenly. It moved slowly along arrow slits and narrow windows, pooling across flagstones and tracing delicate patterns upon frost-laden floors. The emergence of morning was not triumphant, but inevitable, a calm herald of day's quiet promise. Within the sleeping quarters, motions were minimal but deliberate. Bodies shifted gently beneath layers of furs and blankets, stiff joints loosening with slow stretches. Hands and arms flexed cautiously, toes warming in the proximity of neighboring companions, and heads tilted to receive the first glimmers of light. These movements were conscious yet subdued, reflecting the lingering fatigue from the night's vigil and the body's careful adaptation to cold. The transition from darkness to day was measured, never abrupt, allowing both mind and body to awaken without shock. Embers and hearths glowed softly, tended through the night by attentive hands. The faint orange warmth contrasted with the pale morning light, casting gentle shadows across walls and floors. Servants and early risers moved quietly, coaxing life back into the fire, adding small logs or fanning coals with careful motions that preserved both warmth and stillness. Their movements were rhythmic, almost hypnotic, reinforcing a steady cadence of life that contrasted with the harsh silence of hours past. Observing this, one might notice how ritualized care, however mundane, became a subtle instrument of survival. Animals, previously tucked into corners for warmth, began to stir as well. Cats stretched luxuriously, tails curling, while dogs padded softly across stone floors, their breath visible in cooler patches of air. Even livestock in lower chambers shifted, their movements small but purposeful, reflecting the same transition from night's cold to morning's gentler temperature. Their presence reinforced the human rhythm, a reminder that warmth and life were shared, and that the quiet continuity of care extended beyond people to the creatures living alongside them. Some occupants rose fully, rolling out of shared bedding with deliberate care. The habitual gestures learned over years, tucking limbs for maximum warmth, leaning into companions for shared heat, adjusting blankets and furs, continued to guide their movements. The mind, accustomed to slow vigilance, now allowed slightly more freedom, registering the subtle increase in light and warmth. Movements remained soft, respectful of others still asleep, reflecting an ingrained understanding of communal endurance. Patience and attentiveness, learned through repeated nights, were quietly evident in every action. Halls and stairwells echoed with gentle sounds. Footsteps pressed lightly upon stone, doors creaked minimally, and muted murmurs of conversation floated in the background. Children emerged cautiously, guided by instinct and observation, learning to navigate the cool stone floors, to identify warmer patches near fires, and to integrate seamlessly into the ongoing routines of adults. Every step, every careful gesture, reflected the continuity of habit, the quiet structure that had carried them through darkness, and the cumulative knowledge of enduring cold, hardship, and the long hours of night. The castle's architecture, formidable and unforgiving, now revealed subtleties previously hidden. Frost glimmered faintly along window sills. Tapestries hung motionless, and the stone absorbed both the lingering cold and the slowly intensifying warmth. Occupants adjusted their positions according to these changes, closer to embers, nearer to one another, or along slightly sunnier stretches of floor. The day's arrival, though subtle, allowed for measured adaptation, blending survival, comfort, and gentle observation in a rhythm that had been learned, practiced, and quietly reinforced through centuries of repetition. Even in the calm of early morning, the memory of the night's endurance remained. Breath still formed delicate clouds in colder pockets, and residual stiffness reminded the body of hours spent conserving heat. Yet there was a soft relief in observation. The habits of night had been effective, the routines maintained, and warmth could now extend beyond survival to measured comfort. Listeners might imagine themselves drawn into this slow awakening, feeling the subtle rhythms of life transitioning from the vigilance of night to the quiet attentiveness of day. Not all arose immediately. Some remained nestled in furs, drowsing through the gray light, their breathing shallow and steady. Here, historical reality whispered quietly. Some did not see morning. This fact, acknowledged gently, framed the endurance of night not as heroic or dramatic, but as a simple truth absorbed into the gentle cadence of castle life. Survival had been collective, habitual, and deliberate, yet delicate, relying on both physical adaptation and the quiet attentiveness of those awake. By mid-morning, warmth began to spread more steadily. Fires, coaxed from embers, burned with soft light. Doors and windows were adjusted for comfort, and early tasks unfolded with muted purpose. Children, elders, and animals participated in a rhythm that was as calm as it was functional, sustaining the castle's collective habit of endurance. Every small action, shifting blankets, adjusting a log in the hearth, observing the subtle interplay of light and shadow, was part of an ongoing cycle that preserved both life and calm. It was in this quiet, deliberate motion that the castle's inhabitants ensured continuity, not through heroism, but through repeated care. The culmination of these hours exemplified endurance as a gentle, hypnotic practice. The cold, once pressing and persistent, had been negotiated through careful placement, habit, and observation. Minds and bodies had adhered to rituals that supported life without alarm, and attention to small, repeated acts had ensured a gradual, safe transition from night to day. For listeners, this offers a calm meditation on resilience. Survival is not always loud or dramatic. It is often measured, quiet, and persistent. In reflection, the early morning stands as a quiet testament to human ingenuity, observation, and patience. Through hours of stillness, vigilance, and gentle repetition, the occupants of medieval castles moved from the silent threat of cold into measured warmth and light. Their endurance was not marked by spectacle, but by the subtle, repetitive care of both mind and body, a slow choreography of habit that allowed life to continue without drama. The rhythm of awakening, soft and deliberate, embodies the essence of survival framed through calm observation and gentle persistence. Now, as the castle's first morning light continues to spread slowly along stone corridors and timbered halls, we step back and reflect on the quiet journey of the night just past. For hours, darkness held dominion. The cold crept through walls and floors, through cracks in doors and windows, and pressed gently but insistently against every layer of clothing and bedding. Yet, through habit, observation, and careful, repeated action, those who dwelt within these formidable walls endured. They survived by routine, by subtle adaptations, and by the calm attention that framed each small choice. You may imagine yourself nestled into thick furs, blankets drawn close, and the quiet warmth of shared bodies beside you. The night was long, and yet it moved slowly, measured, and predictable. Time passed in subtle increments. A shift here, a breath visible in the cold air there, the faint crackle of embers coaxed to life by careful hands. Life persisted not because of heroism, but because of the quiet repetition of small, deliberate actions, day after day, night after night. And in this rhythm, there's a kind of gentle reassurance, a sense that survival is often less about grand gestures and more about careful attention to the ordinary. Think, for a moment, about the contrast between then and now. Modern warmth envelopes us effortlessly. We live in a world of stoves and central heating, soft beds, and constant light. Yet in medieval times, even the most imposing castle could not escape the cold that came with winter nights. Thick stone walls absorbed heat, but never held it. Towers funneled wind through corridors. Stairwells became icy channels where air moved unchecked. And still, life persisted. People learned to position themselves thoughtfully, to rely on others' warmth, to maintain vigilance in subtle ways, to stretch and flex stiff muscles at intervals, and to place their children or the elderly in positions where shared heat might preserve them. These practices were the quiet architecture of survival, carefully designed and executed without urgency, drama, or alarm. Breath, visible in cold air, reminds us that life is fragile and that temperature, routine, and awareness are deeply intertwined. Each inhalation, each exhalation was a negotiation with the cold. Each movement, no matter how small, preserved warmth, comfort, and safety. Even the night's failures, the ones that arrived silently, unnoticed for some sleepers, were part of this gentle rhythm. Some did not wake again. Historians note softly, but the majority survived through patience and habit, and it is in this persistence that the quiet story of endurance unfolds. As light fills the castle and warmth gradually returns, consider the broader lessons embedded in this slow awakening. Daily life was a collection of small routines repeated with care, tending embers, adjusting furs and blankets, keeping children and the elderly close, moving gently in the corridors, observing animals as subtle indicators of heat and motion, and preserving a constant attentiveness even in the absence of threat. Each of these actions may seem simple or mundane, yet they combine to form a seamless defense against cold, discomfort, and fatigue. In their repetition lies both wisdom and hypnotic calm, a rhythm that allows the listener to drift alongside it toward rest. Even modern comfort, as familiar as it may be, cannot erase the lessons of endurance that these nights taught. There is a subtle beauty in observing how necessity shapes behavior, how routine becomes ritual, and how human ingenuity adapts to environmental pressures without drama. These lessons are quiet, almost invisible in their operation, yet profoundly effective. They remind us that survival is often the product of gentle attention, rather than heroics, of patience rather than force, and of repetition rather than urgency. You can feel it now, if you imagine yourself in the space. The faint warmth radiating from embers, the layering of furs and blankets, the careful positioning of bodies for shared heat. You may hear only the softest sounds, the murmur of conversation, the subtle shuffle of footsteps, the occasional sigh as someone stretches or adjusts. The castle itself becomes a participant in this slow, measured dance, its stone absorbing warmth from the fire, its corridors guiding movement with quiet efficiency, its walls reminding occupants of the constant negotiation with cold. Even the light, creeping through narrow windows, participates gently, offering the promise of warmth without urgency or drama. The endurance of night becomes a meditation in itself. Time is perceived differently in the dark. Hours stretch long, measured not by clocks, but by subtle environmental cues. The shifting of embers, the faint chill along a draft, the movement of companions in sleep. The body, attentive to these cues, adjusts slowly, flexing stiff joints, tucking limbs close for warmth, sharing heat, conserving energy. Even the quietest tasks, stoking the fire, repositioning a blanket, moving to a slightly warmer patch of floor, are acts of survival framed in patience and care. These are not dramatic acts, yet their cumulative effect preserves life, comfort, and the quiet satisfaction of endurance. Imagine, too, the communal aspects of these routines. Children learned through observation, elders were tended with care, and every inhabitant participated in subtle acts that sustained both life and warmth. Animals were companions, their bodies offering heat and gentle reassurance, their motions observed for cues in temperature or habit. The collective rhythm of these early hours exemplifies the calm, repetitive, and deliberate nature of medieval winter survival. It is not thrilling, it is not shocking, and it does not demand attention. Yet it is hypnotically compelling in its order and consistency. As the day progresses, the castle awakens fully. Fires burn steadily, corridors fill with quiet motion, and the frost slowly melts from stones and windows. Yet the echoes of night remain in posture, in careful movements, and in a lingering awareness of the cold that once pressed against every surface. The habits learned in darkness guide the body and mind still, providing a gentle framework for comfort, observation, and reflection. For those listening, this is a lullaby of history, a slow, measured progression from endurance to calm, from vigilance to gentle awareness, and from cold to warmth. Now, as we draw this reflection to a close, consider the gift of warmth and comfort you enjoy in your own modern space. Unlike the inhabitants of medieval castles, you have light, heat, and soft bedding at your disposal. Yet in imagining their night, their patience, their attentiveness, their careful adjustment to cold, you can appreciate not only the fragility of life, but also the steady resilience of those who came before. Their survival, rendered through calm habit and repeated care, is a quiet testament to human adaptability, patience, and the hypnotic rhythm of endurance. You have traveled through their nights safely, along with them, enveloped in this slow, sleep-inducing narration. Take a final moment to notice your own breath, slow and steady, as you settle into comfort. Feel warmth spreading, unrestricted by stone walls or drafty corridors. Reflect on the continuity of life, how those who endured long nights passed knowledge forward, how rituals became routine, and how patience preserved both body and mind. There is no need for excitement, no need for resolution beyond the soft realization that survival is quiet, persistent, and sometimes invisible. This, too, is a gift, one that allows your mind and body to relax, to drift, and to rest, warmed not only by your environment, but by the calm contemplation of history. As you drift further into rest, remember the enduring rhythm of those long nights. You have shared their vigilance, their patience, and their quiet triumph over cold. Their routines, repeated across generations, were not heroic in the dramatic sense, but they were effective, hypnotic, and deeply human. And now, as you rest, you carry forward the calm legacy of endurance, the gentle reassurance that small, careful acts can sustain life, even through the longest, coldest nights. You slept warm tonight, as they once did, through attentiveness, patience, and quiet, persistent care.